Okay, so I think we're just about on time. It's 3:45 in the UK, so I think we can start this this session, which I think is the third session of the day, if I'm keeping track of everything. So there'll be various topics and issues that have already been mentioned in the previous sessions that we might end up revisiting in this one, but that's absolutely fine. I mean, part of the thinking behind this event was to look at some of the same issues from different sort of disciplinary perspectives, just because that can lead to insights that can't be achieved any other way. So that, you know, if any of you who have attended the earlier sessions have any questions that you haven't asked yet, even if they you know, were prompted by things that have been discussed previously, we should be able to sort of introduce them into the discussion here. So as you've already been told for all the other sessions, please do post any questions or even comments in the chat, and I'll try and bring them into the discussion. If you want to ask your question in person, you're very welcome to do that, and just use the raise hand reaction, which if you click the little reaction button at the sort of bottom, kind of the right end of the little sequence of icons at the bottom of the Zoom screen, the raise hand function is just right at the bottom of that. So hopefully that's easy enough to find. Okay, so the structure of this session will be similar to the others. I'll introduce the three speakers, really, or at least three participants that will feature in this session. Then there'll be a sort of short 15-minute presentation from one of the speakers, and then we'll go straight into a sort of discussion that will relate to the things that some of the things that are mentioned in the presentation, but then other things as well. So what I'll do is I'll introduce each of the speakers in turn, and then when I've introduced them, I'll just ask them to respond to the same kind of question that we've used in the other sessions, just really to sort of set the scene, set the context a little bit. And that's basically, I'll ask them to offer a sort of an initial preliminary definition of counterspeech from their particular disciplinary perspective. And then when I've introduced all the speakers that way, I'll ask one of our speakers to give a short presentation. Okay, so that's the sort of plan. So let me start by introducing our first participant, who's Lynne Tirrell. Lynne is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. Her research explores the interconnections between the philosophy of language and social and political philosophy. She's particularly interested in linguistic practices that can facilitate social justice, as well as those that can facilitate injustice, especially in relation to human rights. She's sometimes used an analogy with epidemiology when analyzing discursive toxicity, which can lead to a notion of inoculation against toxic language. And that's something that's already been mentioned in one of the earlier sessions. So I'm sure that's something we can explore a little bit more in this session. So Lynne's particularly well placed, I think, to talk to us today about counterspeech. So before I introduce the other participants, Lynne, would you just like to give us a rough overview of how you yourself would define counterspeech?
Good morning. Thank you, Marcus. I take my concept of counterspeech. Can you hear me okay? I take my concept of counterspeech from the liberal tradition from John Stuart Mill to US Justice Louis Brandeis, where it's about more speech, right? But you have to take that word counter into account, because it isn't just that you say stuff, it's that you are in some way directly addressing speech that you have seen as harmful. And the point is to undermine the harm, so you can't, cliched phrase, you can't unring the bell, right? It's said, it's out there, but all speech creates licenses, and counterspeech is about taking away the license to repeat, reuse, and carry forward the harm. That's in a nutshell, my view.
Yep, that's great. That's really useful. And again, we can explore some of those things in greater depth in the discussion. But it's just helpful for us to kind of, you know, set some parameters and get a sort of frame of reference for the discussion. Okay, so our next participant is Ray Langton. Ray is the Knightbridge Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Cambridge. She has written extensively about many topics relating to moral and political philosophy, the history of philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of law, speech act theory, and many other things too. She's frequently discussed the complex relationship between speech acts and social justice, especially in relation to hate speech. For instance, she's examined how and why hate speech can sometimes acquire authority, and she's argued that blocking is an underappreciated form of counterspeech. So Ray, I guess I'll ask you the same question. You know, what's your sort of broad definition of counterspeech, and would you identify particular characteristics that Lynn didn't mention in her summary?
So thank you very much. I would just first of all agree with what Lynn said about, you know, the classic statements about counterspeech. So from the liberal tradition, you have Brandeis, for instance, saying, if there be time to expose through discussion the falsehood and fallacies, to avert the evil by the processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. But not enough is said about what that speech is and what the evil is of that speech. So my perspective is that speech is about doing things with words. It's about performing certain speech acts. And what that speech act is depends in part on the authority of the speaker. So that applies both to hate speech and to counter speech. So the concept of counter speech is being counter to something. So it's being counter or answering some kind of other speech act. And we're looking in this workshop at hate speech in particular. And there are many different pictures of hate speech. I just want to mention two very important ones, maybe three, I don't know, and Lynn will have more to say, I know. One is a picture of hate speech as words that wound. And that idea of hate speech as words that wound is very influential. It comes from a collection put together by critical race theorists working in this area in the 90s. And Mari Matsuda defines hate speech as conveying a message of inferiority directed against a historically oppressed group that's persecutory, hateful, and degrading. So the idea of hate speech as an attack, as words that wound, counter speech to that is going to be different to counter speech against hate speech that is propaganda. So that's the second kind of hate speech I want to point at. If hate speech is propaganda, then part of it is going to be not just an attack, it's going to be supposedly conveying purported facts, and the counter speech might be in the form of evidence. So the counter speech is going to take a different form depending what kind of hate speech it is opposed to. And then one, I guess, third kind of counter speech, one third kind of hate speech to think about. So Jeremy Waldron, in his book on the harm in hate speech, says that the basic message of hate speech is very often just get out or keep out. And I think that's different to the message of sorts of hate speech that are about promoting violence. But where the speech act is, you know, an imperative, get out, or if it's a claim, we don't like your kind here, or if it's an incitement to violence, people like you should be dead, the kind of counter speech is going to be different depending on the kind of speech act it is. And so we have to look at the kind of speech act it is and the authority of the speaker. So if it's sort of some, a couple of people sort of talking over a drink, that's one thing. If it's a major, if it's a president saying it, that's another thing. So the authority of the speaker is relevant. And I'm interested in how authority influences the effectiveness of hate speech. I think I better stop there.
Thank you, Ray. That's really, really helpful. Good. Okay. And our final participant in this session is Babak Bahador. Babak is Associated Research Professor of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. He's especially interested in how media and communications influence politics and international relations, with a particular focus on peace and conflict. He contributed a chapter on counterspeech to the Routledge Companion to Media, Disinformation and Populism, which was published earlier this year, I think. And in that chapter, he identifies 5 things that enable us to disaggregate counterspeech into smaller factors. And those 5 factors are specifically audiences, goals, tactics, messaging, and effects. It's highly likely that we'll be discussing some of these things later in this session. So my question to you, Babak, is basically the same as the question I've asked so far. Do you largely agree with the sort of definitions that you've heard so far, or is there anything that hasn't been mentioned that you'd wish to add?
Thank you very much, everyone, for your thoughts so far, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. So I see counter speech, again, from more from media communications, research-based perspective, as a response to hate speech, primarily for the goal of either reducing it or reducing its harmful effects online. And as you mentioned, I'm interested in peace and conflict studies. So the type of harm I'm particularly interested in is violence that takes place in examples that are being alleged in places like Myanmar, where discussions on hate speech allegedly contribute to mass ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands of people, and then even going before that on traditional mass media examples like Rwanda and hate radio and so on. So I'm interested in particular offline harms such as violence. I look at hate speech, again, we're talking about specific, the way I define it, we're looking at specific responses, not necessarily talking or discussing these issues in a broader sense, but just responding when you see hate speech. That's the way I kind of look at it. And so the hate speech that I primarily focus on are ones that are, I guess, the more extreme forms of hate speech. So they could be dehumanizing language against groups of people, demonizing language against groups of people, or incitement to harm or violence. And those are, I would say, the ones that most people agree on. There's a whole range of other potential types of speech that might be considered hate speech, which are more disputed, but those 3 I think are the most obvious ones. So I look for when those are evoked, especially by powerful people, as I was mentioned, and especially in political contexts that are potentially conflict fragile. And when those all line up, that's the time where you're likely to have violence. As you mentioned, I look at different audiences. So there's hate groups, and how do you respond to hate groups or hateful people? They're harder to persuade. When people are set on their views, it's very hard to persuade them. So what you try to do, again, when we talk about effects, is bring into account certain kinds of effects and understanding how you could stop them from talking. Things like the spiral of silence that might get them to stop talking if they feel like they're in an unpopular forum, by changing the online norms. The second group, I'll just go through one aspect of this, and I won't go on too long, but the second aspect are the broader audiences. So the broader audiences who are observing, especially online speech, they're going to be potentially willing to participate and step in when they see the online norm changing. And so a kind of a herding effect might take effect, where when some people see the momentum going against hate, they might jump in. The majority of people observing an online forum might agree with that already, but they don't want to step in because they don't want to be maybe challenged. But if they see the trend moving away from hate, then they will come in, and then you get a herding effect against the hateful, which will then potentially cause a spiral of silence for those who are engaging in hate. And then the final group, which are the most important actually, are the vulnerable. Those are people who share the same grievances as those evoking hateful messages. but they're not persuaded yet. And they're the most persuadable. So often impressionable youth who have similar grievances will observe maybe hateful comments online. And depending on the direction and the norm of that online forum, they'll either be more persuaded and participate and maybe become a hate group member, or they will not if the herding goes in a different direction. So segregating the audiences and understanding the messages that might impact them is very important, I think, if you're trying to have effective counter speech. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very, very helpful. And I think at this point, I'll hand back to Lynn, who I think has some slides for us and has a presentation. You should be able to screen share. If not, let me know and I can I can help. Seems to be okay. That looks good. I think you're still on mute though, Lynn.
Okay, so first I want to say thank you to everyone who organized, especially Stephanie, who was very patient with me back and forth in email, and Marcus, but also many others. It takes a lot to put something like this together, and I'm very grateful to be here. So I'm calling this Responding to Toxic Speech Online. I just want to say everything that Babak just said about the social and political context is very dear to my heart, and it's but today I'm just trying to focus online, but for the discussion, we can move much more broadly. When I think about hang on, there we go. So when I think about language, the first thing is to notice the sociality of discourse. It's always thinking about the sociality of discourse. I think about language games and social practices. The reason for that is that we are driven by the norms of behavior, whether we're talking about the broader social practices, our discursive practices as a subset of those, language games as varieties of discursive practices, or speech acts, which are much more specific components of our language games. So each of these things has many faces, many sets of norms and rules that govern it. The reason I start with Wittgenstein also is because his emphasis that a language game is the whole consisting of the language and the actions into which it's woven is something that I think we need to keep in mind. And you'll see why in what I have to say in the next slide, which is, okay, Wittgenstein said, don't get too precise about language games and don't try to come up with, your logical codification of them. I'm paraphrasing. But Wilfrid Sellers in 1957, I think, said, well, yeah, but we can do this. That there's a way you get into a language game. There's stuff you do within it. There are moves that you make that are language moves. And then, excuse me, there are language exit moves. So the language entry moves are what Sellers was mostly concerned with. And it was saying something like, I'm walking across the UConn campus and I say, "Lo, husky," because I've identified a husky, which might be the dog, because some of them do walk around the campus, or it may be one of our student athletes or just a UConn person. In doing that, I take a position in a game and I move from the world to words. Great, a lot of 20th century philosophy focused on exactly that kind of move. Bob Brandom, in his landmark, Making It Explicit, really focused on language moves and focused on the concept of inference licenses, which he takes from Frege. Where the Brandom picture and the Ray Langton picture come together is with the concept of challenges. So Ray's concept of blocking isn't exactly the same as Brandom's challenges, but the idea is that when you when someone makes a move, you can work to challenge it in some way. They can also defer, and I'll say more about that in a minute, but these are all words to words. And then the exit moves, that's what really got me going in my research, in particular my paper, Genocidal Language Games, which looked at the role of changing discursive practices in Rwanda to enable people to participate in the genocide there. It wasn't all propaganda, it wasn't all hate speech, but it was starting to call each other Inyenzi, which means cockroach, and getting used to that, and then being able to see the other as a danger. That's moving from words to the world. Now, for the people concerned with online algorithms and blocking the internet, each one of these is going to be a relevant place to put your finger in the dike and stop the flood. So let me say a little bit more about this central category, inference licenses and language moves. So Mary says, my dog is in my backyard. That's Bowie. He's actually my dog. When Mary says that, she issues inference licenses. That Mary has a dog, a backyard, that the dog is in the yard, and so on. She issues those to her audience, to anyone who hears it, even an eavesdropper. She might be saying it specifically to one person, but someone else hears it. They're now licensed to use that claim. That's an assertion. When they are challenged, how do you know that? You hardly even know Mary. They can defer the justification back to Mary's claim, to what Mary said. So they can also, someone can directly challenge Mary. What dog? You have cats. That's a direct challenge. And Mary has a responsibility to respond to it. So all of this is bound up on the Brandon picture with responsibilities, which is why I have that line from him below, that inferring is a kind of doing. In relation to all of this, there's a process that he calls scorekeeping, which he takes from David Lewis, who was also a teacher of Ray Langton. And many of us in contemporary philosophy of language are indebted to David Lewis for his scorekeeping in a language game paper. In Brandon's hands, what we're doing with scorekeeping is keeping track of speaker commitments. It's not about winning points or losing points, but just keeping track of what each person is committed to by what they have said. Their responsibility, their commitment, is to identify what they're talking about, so which dog, justify the assertion, and also justify any expressive commitments that come with it. So we don't really have to justify expressive commitments with dog language about dogs, but if you start talking about human beings as dogs or as snakes or as cockroaches, then the expressive commitment becomes something that's on the table and needs justification. And finally, scorekeeping keeps track of recipient or hearer entitlements, and that's very important too. Now, this all might seem really kind of conservative, like I say something, then Babak can say something, then Ray can say the same thing, and so on, and we just carry it along. And you see that on the internet all the time, but it's not that conservative. And if you think about it, I mean, it's nice because it captures the virality of the internet, but it's also like the telephone game, where passing assertional and expressive commitments along can bring about changes to them. And some of those changes can be really dangerous. And so keeping track of the way it gets passed along is really important. So to go back to the quote that Ray mentioned in her introduction, if there be time to expose through discussion of the falsehood and fallacies to avert the evil by the processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. So this has come down from Justice Brandeis as, well, look, we have these two choices. We can say more to balance it out or countermand it, or we can impose bans, and bans are usually a bad idea. There's some great discussion of all of this in Maxime Lepoutre's new book, Political Speech in Divided Times, that's just out on Oxford University Press. It's terrific, but I'm not going to get into bans and stuff here. I want to focus on that opening part I marked in red, which is if there be time, because on the internet, speech is instantaneous. It goes right out, and that can be a real problem for issues about blocking or challenging in before the effect takes hold. Paul Virilio, the French philosopher, sociologist, social theorist, calls this temporal compression, and points out that speed takes away the target's time to think and to reply. And speed is a form of power. And so that can make the harms much more, it can make it more impactful. Keep in mind that those harms can be immediate and they can also be ongoing. Excuse me. So this is something I've just been developing. It's not published anywhere, but if you think about counter speech as a form of resistance, then the question that comes up, whether it's in real life or online, the questions that arise strike me as the journalist questions that, you know, every story is supposed to address: who, what, when, where, why, and how. So who do we block or counter? Who does the blocking or countering? It goes both ways. And there are issues about that with respect to expecting the target to counter. Now, the target may have the power to do it. They may be not sufficiently harmed or so terribly harmed by whatever the speech is to be able to respond. But they may be stunned by the speed of it and the impact of it, in which case bystanders can step in and help. But that has to be carefully nuanced, because you want to make sure that the bystander doesn't take away the agency of the target, which is part of what the hate speech or toxic speech is aiming to do. I'm going to skip over the imperfect duty to resist, but we could talk about that in the discussion if we want. So what do we resist? Well, we resist the content on one level, that is the toxin, but we also might resist the dose. Like, it's okay if you say that once, but don't say it 25 times, or the mode of delivery. And I think it's really important in online speech to think about the expressive commitments that are reshaping the norms. In between the what and the when is that set of moves that I outlined from Sellers. So what do you block? Well, you might block an entry move, but that's also kind of when you block it, like on the way in. I don't know if you saw the news today, but YouTube has blocked many, I don't know the exact number, maybe about a dozen very prominent anti-vax and anti-vax websites and people. They have removed over 130,000 videos that have misinformation about COVID vaccines and so on. So at the entry, you block the account. At the in the internal moves, like intra-platform, you're looking at the inference licenses they're issuing, and you may block some of those. And then exit moves is really what we want to be blocking, because we want to stop the violence, we want to stop the harm. But very often, I think with something like the internet, we're stuck with those first two and hope that the exit moves fail because the first two. On the Brandeis quote, "With time matters," I want to just point out we can think immediate and we can also think long game, and that can change the strategy of what we do in terms of developing policies and algorithms. The site of resistance, where we block, can be very important. I'd like to point out too, let me go back to when. The last thing about that is when we block. So, you know, Twitter was great, in my judgment, by finally blocking taking down Donald Trump's Twitter account, but they waited until after he was out of office. So if we think about that, the difference between shutting down his account while he's in office, that's shutting down the account of the President of the United States. That's symbolically very important. They were not willing to do that. And so a lot of damage happened. So the site of the resistance and the target of the resistance and the symbolic significance of that can be very important. Okay, I'm going to skip over the why and the how because we can come back in discussion. I want to go to my final slide, which is responses to toxicity. And here, I'm thinking, and this is really based on the kind of thing that like YouTube has just done. They removed particular offensive or problematic and harmful misinformational videos. They blocked the people who have been promoting those videos and have no plans to reinstate them. And they're adding more speech. They're adding medical sites that have videos from medical sites like the National Academy of Medicine and the Cleveland Clinic in order to put better content on the web, on their site. So remove, block, and add. But the responses to toxicity, which I talk about toxicity instead of only hate speech because it comes in so many forms, basically go in two directions: individual protections and collective action. So the individual cases and individual care, self-care, avoiding turn off the web, reparative tonics. On the internet, I think of like when people say, I'm having a bad day, send me puppy pictures. And then you get this flood of puppy pictures or kitten pictures or something like that. And this happens on various social media accounts from time to time. That would be a reparative tonic. Direct intervention, conversions. So there's a well-known story of Megan Phelps Roper, who was the heir apparent to the Westboro Baptist Church. And she wound up getting involved in discussions on Twitter, like actual discussions on Twitter that led her away from the church. And she wrote a book about it called Unfollow. Collective action strikes me as so much more powerful. The photo on the bottom is one I took in Boston. And you can see the pussy hats and things like that. And I love that in the middle of it, it says words matter. One of the signs says words matter. But anyway, social protest. In real life, we see that physically, but we also see it on the web. And one of the ways we see it is through hashtag activism. So, hashtag Black Lives Matter, to hashtag Me Too, which right now the media is saying that the R. Kelly conviction is the first legal conviction under, like, in response to the Me Too movement. And so that would be a pragmatic consequence and a real life consequence of the hashtag activism, which often gets a bad name as if it's so passive, but it really isn't. So changing norms, how do people do that? And some of the ways that people do it is by flooding, mobbing, hacking. The hack of Epic, oh my goodness, that is like really something to study. And then accumulation and display is a really really important thing that people do, where they gather up all the instances and then they show them collectively, and that gives you a different perspective. So these are just a few of the things that people can do: removing, blocking. I would put accumulation and display on adding, because even though it doesn't add content, it adds perspective. I don't know, just to say I'm a philosopher, I don't know how to write an algorithm. I hope some of the people in the audience do and could figure that out. And everything I've said here so far is based on philosophy of language and social and political philosophy, but I've tried to show how it's connected to internet kinds of concerns. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lynn. That's really really helpful. Gives us lots of things that we can draw upon a little bit further. Before we start addressing questions that might come from people in the in the audience. I just wondered whether either Ray or Babak, whether you had any initial thoughts. I mean, it can be positive, it can be negative, it can just be additional comments, anything resulting from Lynn's presentation. Go ahead, Ray. I see you've unmuted yourself.
Okay, thank you. So I find this really interesting and helpful, and I'm trying to put together, I mean, Lynn knows I'm interested in this. I'm trying to put together Lynn's picture of, you know, toxic, poisonous speech to which there might be an antidote, which is a kind of causal picture of a certain kind of problem and how it gets resolved. I'm trying to put together that picture with Lynn's philosophical picture of the speech as changing certain sorts of norms and making things more normatively appropriate than they otherwise would be. So it becomes okay to think of the Tutsi as being like cockroaches. It becomes more appropriate once you start calling them cockroaches to start treating them as you know, vile pests to be eliminated. So the change in social norms seems a bit different to the picture of a, you know, there's the normative picture and the sort of causal poison toxicity picture, and I'm just trying to understand a bit better how they fit together.
Go ahead, Lynn.
So I wanted to, this is a bit hand wavy, but I mean, the first thing to keep in mind is that I go back to a relatively inscrutable paper by Wilfrid Sellers on the manifest image and the scientific image of the human being. He says man, right? But and that really is the scientific image is that causal picture, and the manifest image is more of a phenomenological picture, right? And I am currently digging into the psychiatric book called The Body Keeps the Score. And for people like Ray and myself who are like constantly thinking about scorekeeping and language games, the idea of the body keeping score is like just, well, for me, it's really fertile ground for thought. So in that book, there are a lot of examples of ways in which harmful actions and harmful speech actually cause physiological changes to the body, and so to future responses that are not completely in the agent's control anymore because they've been conditioned in some way or another. And this is beyond my expertise at this point, but I'm hoping that in not too long, I'll be more expert at it. But really the effect of the speech, not just on our self-regulation because of what we think it's okay to do, but on our internalization into our very bodies of our sense of what we are and what we are capable of and what we can do is really where I think the answer to that is going to lie.
Go ahead, Ray.
No, I was just saying thanks.
Okay. No, it strikes me as an important issue, the vocabulary around toxicity and to some extent disease that's associated with various forms of what might be called hate speech or toxic speech. And I think one point I'd just sort of contribute for people to think about is that it's obviously being used by analogy, I guess, although as you suggest, Lynn, there might actually be some ways in which it's not just an analogy. If this thing has a physical impact, then obviously it's more than just an analogy. But there was an article that Stephanie and I published about a year ago that looked at online hate speech and looked at automated ways of quarantining hate speech. And the whole basis of that paper was really to treat hate speech as a computer virus. So in other words, not necessarily a physical biological virus, but a bit of software that is malicious and is intended to do harm, which is identified automatically by the software on your computer if you've got it set up right. And it's not just destroyed or just removed, but is put aside so that it can't do harm. And then you have the option of whether you want to engage with it or whether you want to remove it. So I think the language of toxicity and disease and viruses, I think it can operate in various ways, some of them literal and some of them more analogical and metaphorical. So I think there's a whole sort of range of things there. Babak, was there anything that you wanted to say in response to any of this or Lynn's presentation?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Lynn, for the presentation. I have just a couple of responses I wanted to ask questions about. The first one is, you mentioned Brandeis and the idea of more speech, which has often been evoked as a way to deal with hate speech because people will potentially be persuaded when they hear more speech and the rational outcome might emerge. This reminds me of, to some degree, of the idea of within the public sphere, Habermas, that we have a form in which the best ideas rise to the top, and people are generally rational and will reach some kind of version of the truth. Now, critics of this in the internet age argue that now we don't have one public sphere, but we have multiple public spheres, and people, due to cognitive dissonance, feeling uncomfortable, will switch to those spheres that align with their existing predispositions, beliefs, and therefore we can't really discuss the idea of more speech because people don't ever hear speech that doesn't align already with their views. So that was the first point I wanted to just get your response to. The second point is around the idea that people are rational, they're going to get to some kind of rational understanding that facts will matter to them. A series of critics would argue that people are generally irrational, they're emotive, they're tribalist at their core when it comes to decision making. And this liberal assumption doesn't hold when you look at what's happening in practice. People are hard to persuade if they have existing beliefs that they're set on. And due to confirmation bias, they actually search for and ignore and interpret information in a way that aligns, again, with their existing beliefs. So therefore, they don't go through a rational process by which they can be persuaded. So just based on those two sets of potential critiques, how would you respond to those? I don't necessarily agree with them myself, but I hear those often invoked.
Okay, so just this morning, I was looking at Mill on Liberty, and every like linguistic libertarian likes to cite Mill, and people like to talk about Mill having this marketplace of ideas as well. So, and I found this passage that I'd forgotten about and I'm going to read it to you because I seriously just wrote it down today. The dictum that truth always triumphs over persecution is one of those pleasant falsehoods which men repeat after one another till they pass into commonplaces, but which all experience refutes. This is Mill. History teems with instances of truth put down by persecution. If not suppressed forever, it may be thrown back for centuries. So, the person who's most attributed to the marketplace of ideas doesn't actually think that the truth will always out and that reason will always prevail. And another place where Mill is relevant to this discussion is, so I know I'm using Mill to answer, but I can say things of my own too. But the other place where Mill is relevant is in chapter 1 On the Subjection of Women. There's a passage in there that I love where I'm not going to read it to you, but where he talks about reason versus custom. And he's arguing that if you're rational about it, you think that the subjection of women doesn't make sense because it impedes progress, it undermines equality, all kinds of, and it's immoral. But we're not rational about it, and we have customs. And he says there that when reason comes up against custom, custom always wins. And so for me, that resonates to the norm the power of norms to shut down reason. And so I'm not an irrationalist, but what I think is that, you know, all the things going on with echo chambers and bubbles, that part of what's happening there is that reason is being quarantined and damaged within it. And so only certain things are counting as evidence, only certain things are counting as reason within those bubbles. And so those customs of thought, those habits of thought, I think are really problematic. And we need to identify them and figure out whether they need an antidote, whether they need to be quarantined. I love Marcus's point about quarantining like a computer, like treating it like a computer virus. So, you know, Habermas is right. There are multiple spheres, and what counts as rational and true in different spheres may be well supported within that sphere, but that doesn't mean that the norms are appropriate and in balance. And so I think that's really a crucial point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Ray.
This is just following up Babak and Lynn's point, and I know lots of people will have questions, so I won't take long. But just I want to, yes, agree about Mill and Brandeis. So if you, the one thing that Lynn mentioned is Mill's, when you read Mill together with the subjection of women, you know that he actually had very complex and nuanced things to say about the relationship between liberty and equality, and he thought that oppression was incompatible with knowledge and with freedom. And so there's a lot there when you put it all together, and that's spelt out in a paper about John Stuart Mill and the harm of pornography that I can put it in the chat later if you want. The other thing about Mill that I think is really relevant to our discussion today on the internet, even though he wasn't thinking of the internet. So he made a big distinction between an opinion, as he put it, that's circulated through the newspapers, that the corn dealers are the starvers of the poor. It's one thing to say in a letter to the newspaper, the corn dealers are the starvers of the poor. And it's another thing to say that when you're in front of a big angry crowd, in front of the house of the corn dealer. So in one case, it's expressing an opinion. In the other case, it's inciting the crowd to violence. And one of the tricky things is that it's much harder to make that distinction when, you know, an offhand remark, which is a bit like even more informal than a letter to the paper, can suddenly be like a big banner in front of a crowd, because the internet is what makes that happen and undermines exactly the difference that Mill thought was important. And then for Brandeis, Brandeis, I'm just going to put the bit of the quotation there. It's Lynn also quoted it. One thing that people don't take seriously is the idea that counterspeech is absolutely the key to free speech if you're going to take what he said seriously. So he was assuming that there would be time to answer false speech with true speech, or evil speech with good speech, however you understand it. But he sort of made it conditional. So if Mill is right and there isn't, and it's not always going to work out, then to that extent, and I'm not endorsing this, I'm just saying it follows from Brandeis's picture that there is a case for enforced silence where there isn't time to have counter speech. So this is all the more reason for saying we had better bring about the possibility of counter speech, because if not, the alternative is enforced silence. So thank you.
Thank you. There's one topic that actually came up in one of the earlier sessions, but it seems to me relevant here just from the sort of definitions that you each gave at the start, and also from a couple of things in Lynn's presentation. So you know, if we're thinking of these issues, tracing the development of thought back to Wittgenstein at least, then there's obviously the strong emphasis on words and words being, you know, the fundamental units in some ways of language games, not necessarily the only units, but fundamental units. And I'm thinking of titles like Austin's How to Do Things with Words from 1955. And then Lynn, in your presentation, you spoke about the move from world to words and then from words to world. Obviously, in the modern age of you know, internet communication and online interactions, we're well aware that culture is becoming increasingly multimodal, and that words are simply part of a much more complex set of things that are combined to form multimodal complexes, really, that are used to communicate messages. I mean, obviously memes are normally a combination of words and images. And some of the research that some of the students, for instance, in the engineering department are doing in these kind of areas are trying to develop automated systems that identify automatically multimodal hate speech, so not just text-based or language-based hate speech. I just wondered if it's worth just reflecting on that a little bit. I mean, in these contexts, when we're talking about words, we're not just talking about words, are we? Or are we?
No.
I just want to point out that a lot of the people who are doing really significant work in online hate, like I think of Danielle Citron. She's very concerned with the power of images as well, and the combination of words and images. And the thing too is, again, that journalistic set of questions: who, what, when, where, why, how. When you know, take a meme, when that meme goes out will make a difference to whether it becomes viral or not. And it will also make a difference to its the kind of impact it has, not just the degree of impact. Like virality is just saying, well, a lot of people saw it, right? And a lot of people passed it along, but people can passively pass things. So one of the things that I like about the inferentialist picture is, I'm gonna wave my hands here. So you start with one thing, right? And here's my meme. And then I pass it along, but then it spreads to two other memes that are related but not the same, and then they spread, and then pretty soon there's like memes of the memes. And you see this with like Pepe the Frog. It wasn't just one Pepe the Frog image that went out. It became at least hundreds of thousands of different variations, right? And I'm sure that there are people who can track that. I don't actually have a number because I can't track it, but the point is that, you know, these branches of the inferential network from the initial locution, the phrase, the word, the phrase, or the meme, those branches have branches of their own. And so that's part of why, if you think of it as pruning and saying, no, that branch goes, then you get a different kind of picture. But excuse me, I think we don't want to be too focused on just words, because words are not always the purveyor of the harm. I did research, I'll be quick about this, but I did research in the 90s that I never did anything with, in which I gave surveys to students at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, at UMass Boston, and Georgetown University. And these surveys were anonymous, but very detailed about third-person understanding of like, what kinds of speech do you think harms? And what really surprised me was how many people, they didn't pick racist epithets most of the time. And words like babe, honey, like we're not going to ban babe. We're not going to ban honey, right? but how it's used, by whom, under what circumstances, can turn it from a term of endearment to a put down, right? There were some predictable things, but there were a lot. And it was really funny because at UMass Boston, the rumor went around that I was trying to come up with a list of words to ban. And so I put some of the words up on my door saying, we can't ban these words, right? But so anyway, the point is, we can't focus too much on the words. It has to be the word in the context of the Speech Act, in the context of the discursive practice and the social practice. And then we get the problem. Then we see what the problem is.
Which makes the attempt to automate this so difficult, obviously, right? Because the context matters so much.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, context is one of the hardest things to factor into any sort of automated process, other than immediate linguistic context. I mean, you know, a few words to the left, a few words to the right, that's simple enough. But putting it in a broader socio-political cultural context is non-trivial, to put it mildly. Any other thoughts, comments on that issue, the sort of, you know, beyond words issue, before we shift to some of the questions that are coming in? If not, then, okay, so this is a question I think that raises some interesting issues, certainly if we're viewing this from a sort of, you know, to some extent, you know, Wittgensteinian or sort of Gricean kind of pragmatics perspective. So should counterspeech online target the original speaker? I think often when we think about this from the standpoint of spoken interactions, you know, we often think about the original speaker and then the interlocutor, and there's some kind of, you know, discussion between them. Of course, that's different online. So online, there are these situations where people can post a profoundly offensive message and then just go away, and they might never revisit the site. They might never read any of the responses. So the question is really, who should the counterspeech be aimed at? You know, what if the original poster of the offensive message is no longer on the platform? So is the counterspeech more a performative act that's aimed at the broad community that might be there to see the response? And does that have some sort of impact on the kind of counterspeech that might be used? I just wondered if that's a scenario that it's worth thinking about a little bit in the context of the kind of frameworks we've been mapping out so far.
Yeah, sorry, can I?
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's obviously right, that counterspeech is very often not going to be directed against the initial speaker, or directed towards the initial speaker, because the initial speaker might not be there. I mean, the main thing is, you know, in the terms that Lynn was using, the main thing is how things are, how you can contribute to the ongoing speech situation or the ongoing language game, so that the initial speech act has got a different force. So you're disempowering it, so to speak. And that might be by providing counter evidence, or it might be by diminishing its authority, or it might be by something completely different again. You know, I mean, one thing, and this connects with, I can see Daisy Dixon's question in the side there about whether image-based hate speech can be harder to counter with speech. I mean, this also, so there are kinds of speech where the best way to counter it isn't to talk about the actual speech that you're countering at all, but this then interacts with the discussion earlier in this conference about relational counter speech, where it's relating to a particular claim and trying to refute maybe that claim. I mean, completely different way to think about counter speech, it would be as a corrective to the general holistic speech situation. So for instance, where there's a lot of racist speech, can there be a lot of counter speech which is just in the form of different sorts of affirmations? So if the racist speech is not going to do its job, if there are, I don't know, this is why schools have got, you know, stories about Martin Luther King and you know, when there are very visible stories of that contradict the message without explicitly contradicting them.
Go ahead. First, Babak, and then Lynn.
Oh, I would just add that it's important to look at the multiple audiences that are likely going to see the counter speech. So the initial person who maybe had the hateful comment is the one that's going to be least likely to be affected because they've had some kind of strong belief around hate already built. So we know it's very hard to change those kinds of views. They may just be less likely to participate if the norms change. I think the two most important audiences that are going to be potentially affected are, again, the vulnerable, those who are, again, sharing grievances but haven't fully committed to the hate ideology or the hate group, and the broader audience who's observing, who can then join in and create that norm change online. So I think those two audiences are the most important ones when it comes to actually having an effect.
Thank you. Lynn.
So I want to say that in some cases, if you think back to the journalistic list, the focus might be on the symbolic significance of your response. If you're trying to come up with a direct response to something that's become a common parlance, but is on its way to becoming a common parlance, you might not go to the original poster or the original speaker, but you might go to someone who has picked it up, who's particularly prominent, and then they become an exemplar. And so, I think teachers do this in school all the time when a bunch of kids are saying something, but they pick on like the most popular kid and say, don't say that anymore. And so, you get a politician who repeats it, you counter speech to them, and that sets an example for other people. So that's one thing. But I think the idea of the corrective to the general speech situation is really important, and that can work in both directions. I have a paper called Toxic Speech, Inoculations and Antidotes. And if you think just in terms of those two things, inoculations prevent, but antidotes cure, right? Or mitigate. So sending out the generalized corrective speech, the added more speech that sets the new norm, the better norms, can inoculate some, but it can have an effect of helping others see their way out of it. Not the people that Babak is worried about and saying they're not going to leave, they're not going to change, but there are people on the margins who you can reach through that. And so I think you can think of them as metaphors of inoculation and antidotes, but sometimes that general speech can work in one way for one person or group, and in the other way for others. Sometimes an inoculation, sometimes an antidote.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I think the discussion of the audience for different types of hate speech is throwing up some interesting suggestions here. So one that's just come into the chat, I mean, it gives the context of Ray's discussion of Mill's distinction between offering an opinion and incitement. But basically the question is, how can we productively counter all the speech that can be taken up in awful ways without at the same time amplifying and/or lending credibility to those interpretations? I mean, it seems to me that's worth thinking about in this context. In some cases, a silent response might be deemed inadequate, but it doesn't draw attention to the thing that's being said, whereas a more elaborate form of counter speech than silence might well amplify and seemingly give some sort of credibility to an interpretation that's just fundamentally flawed or problematical. Any thoughts on that? Go ahead, Ray.
Just to say, I completely agree that sometimes taking to use Brandeis's term, the evil speaker, seriously, is to give them a place at the table that they don't really deserve. This ties in with, very familiar things online, with online discussion about don't feed the trolls, don't give it the attention that it's seeking. Especially, one thing we haven't mentioned is the whole economy of attention, or maybe we have, but you know, in an economy of attention, giving attention is rewarding in itself, even if the attention you're giving is trying to refute it. So that is that's all the more reason to have indirect forms of counterspeech, in my view, rather than saying X said something false, let's all put the spotlight on X. Just get more good stuff out there, so to speak.
Okay, go ahead, Lynn.
Thank you, Mike Barnes, for that question. And Ray, I like your turning us to the attention economy. I say this with some hesitation, but maybe some people in the audience or on the panel know. When I think about not amplifying, I think about how good lawyers are at that. So, you know, in a courtroom battle, lawyers do not repeat, especially criminal lawyers, but any kind of lawyer, they don't repeat the claims of their adversary. Philosophers do that. You know, we put a whole long discussion of everything that the other person said, and then we refute it. Lawyers would leave that paragraph or page or section out, and they issue the counter argument without amplifying what's actually been said. And so I think it would be really interesting to study principles of legal argumentation in this kind of context. I haven't done it. Maybe people have, and someone could point me to it, but because the rhetoric of legal argument is to not amplify your opponent, that could be really used. There could be some really useful material there. Anyone know? We have lawyers here, right?
I hope we haven't all brought our lawyers with us. It's not going to be that kind of discussion. I think it's. Go ahead, Babak.
I would just add that, however, when there is a response, we don't necessarily need to amplify the specific point they've made, but we could amplify the potential effects of their words. So potential harm that could be done to certain audiences from their effects. So you're not directly repeating it, but you're saying, oh, this could lead to this, which is, you know, going to highlight the negative consequences of their words, again, especially to the vulnerable audiences and the broader audience. And also, if you are going to engage them, you can engage them at the level of motivation, not at the level of, you know, the claim. So what's driving it? Is it some kind of fear of, you know, your life changing because immigrants are moving? And, you know, what is that the reason why this fear is created? Or is there other things going on, such as maybe economic inequalities leading you to, you know, a lower standard of living, or some kind of fear that, you know, your way of life is going to change? So engagement at the motivation level, I think, has been shown to be effective at times. It can lead to discussions where people kind of actually themselves, who might be saying hateful things, then reconsider what they're saying and reconsider what the drivers are of why they're saying what they're saying. So I think responding not to the claim that this group is, you know, criminals, but saying, what are you really concerned about? I think those can be more effective in terms of getting to the root of what's going on for all audiences affected.
And people have probably seen Kathy's post in the chat about the amplification issue, and it sounds very much as if that's something that will be discussed at greater length, perhaps in the next session. So that's something to sort of maybe come back to and revisit. While we're thinking a little bit about the audiences of hate speech and the way in which that relates to counter-speech strategies, I'm aware that some of the people attending this session are professionally involved in the development of, you know, automated systems that are either dialogue systems or what are often known as virtual personal assistants, you know, things like Siri and Alexa and Cortana, and these automated systems that we sort of, you know, talk to at various points during the day. And one of the reasons why amongst the sort of computer science community or the information engineering community, one of the reasons why counter-speech has become a topic that started to receive a lot more attention is in that context of if you've got an automated system that you're having conversations with, how should it respond to hate speech? And if we think that counterspeech is a useful way of dealing with hate speech, then we need to automate counterspeech. But if we take a step back, I think it might be interesting to get the perspective of our participants in this session as to whether we need to worry about the impact of hate speech when it's directed towards an entirely automated system. So if a human user insults Siri or Alexa or Cortana in a way that's, let's say, sexist or something like that, just using very, very, very offensive sexist language. Do we need to worry about that at all from a sort of philosophy of language broadly or a media and communications perspective? Because, I mean, automated systems don't currently have protected characteristics, they don't have human rights, they don't have consciousness, they don't have a whole load of things that human beings have. Is it a subject we should worry about, or is it a red herring? Go ahead, Ray.
Well, I mean, this brings up something that's sort of been on my mind since this workshop started, which is that we can't tell they're automated systems. This is really relevant to how they get treated. So when you have, first of all, this raises a moral issue that we haven't really addressed. So is it okay to just propagate counter speech through AI where people are taking them to be genuine speakers? That's actually a serious moral issue that we haven't looked at so far. But also, if from the point of view of speakers and hearers and bystanders, you can't tell whether something is an AI or not, then how it's treated is going to bear on how, the groups of real life people that the AI resembles are going to be treated. So it doesn't settle the question whether it itself is a human being, though that is, of course, a question that's of philosophical and perhaps moral importance in its own right, but just the resemblance and the apparent continuity in appearance between the AI and real people is enough to mean that it's going to matter enormously how they are treated. And so if they're, anyway, so that's just the point of principle, but I haven't got a particular recommendation. That's too hard.
Lynn,
I would just...
Oh, okay, sorry, Lynn, and then you
Babak. It's okay, Babak can go.
Please go ahead, Lynn. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking that, there's always the boomerang effect. So you can say, well, if you talk to Siri that way, you get into the habit of talking that way. And so it has a boomerang effect on people in that way. I don't want to be so anthropomorphic that I always want to bring it back to people, but I do want to think about it in terms of the propagation of norms. And these AI systems, as I understand it, they learn. And so maybe they don't learn because they have consciousness, but they change their patterns. They change their inferential patterns. That is, it may be, I don't know, I don't work with Siri or Alexa, but if I start using hate speech terms or slurs, I start using slurs against my Siri at certain times, Siri may start to say, oh, when the slur comes, this is what comes next. And so that internal part of the picture that is on my program with the language moves, the AI systems are working with that. And so we're training them to get used to and draw inferences from the use of those terms, and they become part of what's normal for them. And that may mean that they start to also use those terms. I would assume that the programmers could put certain kinds of blocks in, but those blocks might be able to be overcome by frequency of use. And so I think some of the problems are going to be the same problems about the development of inferential networks and norms, even though it's not, even assuming that there isn't consciousness, that inferential role theory is actually, because it's so much of a social behaviorist account, the behavior is going to change, and the behavior is not going to be behavior that we want to see happening. So I think we do need to worry about it.
Thank you. And just echoing some of the same ideas, I think it could lead to references to AI that are more like dog whistles that are targeting another group. So it might be misogynistic, for example, when you maybe say something back to Siri. One recent phenomenon, which is somewhat analogous, is like Donald Trump referring to China, like the state of China as being somehow responsible for COVID, and that leading to potentially acts of violence against Asian Americans who are not the state of China, but people make these kind of inferences or associations. And so I think we have to think about if they're being used in kind of ways that can lead to associations that can then ultimately lead to harm.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And again, you've probably seen in the comments, Joshua said that currently in German elementary school, they're teaching children to be polite to systems such as Siri. So I guess the idea is to sort of inculcate appropriate behavioral norms at an early age, and then hope that they don't reject those norms when they become teenagers or something, which is often what does happen. So we've got about sort of 10 minutes left, so I'm keen to make sure that we focus on things that people want us to focus on. I see another comment that's just come in. I'm just reading that through. Just give me a second. So this is the distinction between audiences that Babak was talking about, and how we might be able to handle the practice of trolling or doing it for laughs when it comes to the spread of hate speech. Seems like a potential added group for the at-risk adults or teens that are part of the internet norm of not taking things seriously, jokes, memes, and trolling. This norm seems like it might be very difficult to countermand, since any attempt will probably be right by joking about it and or trolling. In other words, what might we be able to do about these online groups that may only be at risk, but are part of a norm that resists counterspeech? I don't know whether, Babak, since that relates to what you were saying about audiences, whether you have any thoughts on that.
Well, it's interesting, meme culture and kind of joking meme culture often actually could lead to violence. The Christchurch massacre that took place was by an individual who's engaged in a lot of these kind of online memes in his rhetoric. And in fact, even when he was just about to go and do the massacre, he started to make references to, online personalities and inside jokes that you would have to be aware of that kind of 4chan, 8chan kind of rhetoric to understand exactly what he was talking about. So I think, it could be potentially dangerous, but then on the other hand, it could be completely not dangerous, which is why the context is very important. And you have to understand what the jokes are about, what they're referencing. And it actually often sometimes mixes serious and non-serious as well, just to throw people off. So it's quite complicated, but I think we should be aware of it and understand it as researchers of hate speech and counter speech to know what the references are to more specifically.
Thank you. One topic that I guess personally I'm sort of quite interested in. So part of my own research is focused very much more at the sort of philosophical end of the spectrum, but then I'm also based in the machine intelligence laboratory in the engineering department here at Cambridge. So I'm actively involved in developing systems of various kinds, things that detect hate speech and multimodal hate speech and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that frustrates me on a regular basis is how these two particular groups, those that are interested in, say, philosophy of language, and particularly sort of, you know, Wittgensteinian or Gricean pragmatics or something like that, how that group and the more sort of, you know, computer science-based information engineering group almost never seem to talk to each other. They go to different conferences, certainly the academic communities. They're often in different faculties and departments at universities around the world. And one of the motivations for organizing an event like this was to try to bring together people who aren't normally in the same space, whether it's a physical space or a virtual space at the same time. I just wondered whether any of our panelists in this session had any sort of suggestions. Well, first of all, do they think it would be helpful if those two groups spoke to each other more often? And assuming that the answer to that is yes, how might that be achieved in practical, logistical terms, especially given that we all tend to be completely block booked and completely swamped with doing what we're doing already. So adding on a whole load of additional meetings and workshops and whatever on top of that would be almost impossible for most people, I imagine. Any thoughts about that, how those two communities might interact more effectively? Ray.
So I completely agree with you that we don't get out enough in one way. But sorry, can you just say again what the two groups are, just so I'm clear, because there are lots of groups that don't.
Yeah, there are lots of groups.
Enough.
I mean, and just for purposes of keeping it relatively simple, I'm just thinking about, say, people interested in the sort of aspects of the philosophy of language that we've been primarily discussing in this session, and then the group that's more focused on, you know, computer science, information engineering, the people writing the code, basically. How and there are thousands of other groups as well, but just for simplicity's sake, those two groups.
Well, so, I mean, I can, you know, from the philosophy side, I can say, you know, why something like this event is really helpful, because I've been to lots of philosophy conferences where on the one hand you have, you know, people who are, you know, the contemporary incarnation of Brandeis's optimism, who just assume that we're all rational agents who are going to speak to each other and the truth will out in the end. So it's really good to have not just an empirical hunch, but some empirical data about how speech actually works, you know, in the wild. And also the other thing is, when we're thinking about counterspeech, and I have been, in fact, Lynn and I have both been at a conference recently, a summer school, on the topic of resisting speech that was in Vienna, that brought together lots of different people and from different disciplines. But still, there's a sense in which the picture of resisting speech that we were working with was, you know, still one person says something and that's false, and another person gets up and says something that's true, and they say it very loudly, and it's not working. Why not? So I'm oversimplifying, because there was a lot of incredibly helpful work that was coming in that conference, but there was also a certain degree of you know, hand wringing and pessimism. And in some ways, one thing I find helpful in this workshop is finding out from people working in other disciplines what does work and what has worked and what hasn't worked, and some particular hazards and how things can backfire, because there's no doubt that there's a certain kind of what philosophers call ideal theory going on in our understanding of how language use works in general, and also on the internet, with far too rosy pictures of how it works. And this is where, so it can be very useful in that direction. In the other direction, I don't know. I would have to let someone from the other disciplines know. I mean, as a philosopher, you know, I find it odd hearing people discuss things in such a manipulative way about speech that is going to treat a problem. But it's very interesting to hear that going hand in hand with the picture that this is actually can be a, you know, reasonable conversation amongst human beings, as well as being a kind of treatment. So I'm used to think of these as somewhat pulling it apart. But sorry, this is giving my own perspective on an event like this as an example of how it can be good.
Thank you. Lynn.
So following up on that, I agree with everything that Ray just said. In philosophy, we tend to think, we have tended to think more in terms of, a speaker says something to a hearer and there might be a bystander. And then we worry about those three parties, right? And recently, there's been much more attention to groups, right? But groups are made up of individuals. And so there's a lot of accountability issues when you start keeping track of that. On the practical side of how to bring groups together, I think we need more grants to have more conferences and visiting postdocs and things like that. And I think that's happening to some degree, but it may be happening more within disciplinary boundaries, because the way our jobs work is that you get rewarded for being rewarded within your discipline, as opposed to, that's changing to some degree as well. And so that what I'm suggesting is that we can try to create the opportunities, but we also need to create acknowledgement of the work that people are doing that crosses these area boundaries as really crucial work. Because if we don't do that, then we're not going to have the best and brightest new minds coming to it. Senior people who have secure jobs can move into the less well-charted territory, but we need to make it so that new territory can be charted by the emerging scholars and workers. So I'm all for it, and I agree with Ray that we do need. I need to know what's manageable. So one thing about this conference that is really, or workshop, is it's focused on looking for automated, and I couldn't come to the morning session, so I don't know if this came up, but automated counterspeech, excuse me, and the non-automated work that's being done by the internet platforms, where they have, this ties in with the issue of context and looking at things in context, where they have actual human beings, like looking for things that have to come down because of the harm that they do, like YouTube having people look for violence online, like beheadings and slasher films and things like that. That takes a terrible human toll. So, we need the human judgment to tell. You don't really need a lot of judgment to tell that it's a beheading, but for some of the things you need judgment to tell that it's really harmful. But making that judgment and viewing potentially harmful work again and again for so many hours a day in your cubicle is really damaging to people. So I want to applaud everyone who's here, who's working on the automated side of it, because you will be, when that becomes viable, really viable, you will be saving all of those people who are now doing it by hand. And that's really hard.
Yeah, that's a very important point. We're almost out of time. Babak, did you have anything you wanted to say to sort of draw this session to a close?
I really appreciate this group that's being brought together today, this panel, and learning more about the kind of contributions of philosophers to this debate, because we often, as academics, also are in our own silos and don't look outside media and communications or political science, in my case, to see what others are doing. There are obviously organizations such as this organization, and one at GW, IDDP, that was recently set up with a grant from the Knight Foundation that tries to bring together computer scientists with social scientists to try to get us some of these questions. My final, I guess, thought is that there is still some research that shows that people, I did mention that, it's very hard to persuade people who are set on their views, but there is some research that certain kinds of messaging can work. One study I wanted to mention at some point was one done by Bruno and company that looked at how prejudice, collective prejudice, was overcome in certain cases by they first told people that should all Muslims be blamed for the act of a terrorist, an individual Muslim, and some people said yes, and then they were asked, should all Christians be blamed for the act of a terrorist, like Dylan Roof type figure? And then some of those people that said yes to the first case then said no, so they actually changed their mind. So there are opportunities to, through various methods such as showing potential hypocrisies people hold, that you can actually change people's minds. There are other cases as well, so it's not a completely lost cause that those who have hateful views can't be changed, but they're the most difficult to change. That was just like my final thought I wanted to share.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think the thought that it is sometimes possible to change someone's mind is a good positive thought to end on, maybe. That's it. I think we're at the end of this session. It's 5:15 here in the UK. The next session will start in about 15 minutes. And obviously we're very aware of sort of screen fatigue and things. So if you have been to all the sessions so far today, do make sure you sort of stand up and walk about and do some stretching before the final session. But I'd just like to thank our 3 participants who took part in this session. Lots of ideas there, many of which I think would have benefited from another 3 or 4 hours discussion. But hopefully we got into as much detail as we could in the time available. And thank you all for participating. I know you're all extremely busy, to give you a virtual round of applause. So yeah, next session starts in about 15 minutes, and hope to see most of you back here. And as before, you're welcome to stay on the Zoom call, and if you like, just close your mic and your camera, and then things will start up again in about 15 minutes. Unless there's anything, Stephanie, that you wanted to say in advance of that, or?
No, it's all good. No.